Final Furlong Podcast is proudly brought to you by Geoff Banks Bet. Get up to £500 refunded as real money for new Geoff Banks online accounts after your first month of betting. Use promo code FFP500 at geoffbanks.bet.
Welcome to the Final Furlong Podcast. I'm Emmet Kennedy. It is great to have your company. Something a little bit different today. I'm joined by two special guests as we talk about a massive story that really we've been covering on this show for quite some time, but it is one of the most critical discussions in British and Irish racing, but particularly the future of British racing, and that is restrictions, affordability checks, and a £3 billion in real terms black hole that racing has fallen into over the last 2 years. A devastating 25% decline attributed primarily to affordability checks which are aimed at curbing problem gambling but have driven many bettors to unregulated markets or out of the game altogether. It's left racing with a financial black hole as media rights, sponsorships, and the levy, crucial funding streams, dwindle alongside betting revenue. I'm joined by two special guests. One is a sponsor of this show, so obviously we're going to talk him up, but he is a vocal critic of this and one of the most powerful voices in racing, CEO of Geoff Banks Bet, Geoff Banks, and one of the most vocal critics of this as well, and one of the most powerful names in racing, CEO of the Jockey Club, Nevin Truesdale. It's great to have you both back on the show. Nevin, if I can start with you first of all, I think there might be a sort of a flippant attitude from some people towards this story. It doesn't bother me. I just want to talk about who's going to win the Queen Mother Champion Chase at Cheltenham, and I can understand all of that, but why should fans be so very much concerned about this for racing's future?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Emmet. And I think, the weekend we just had epitomises your question brilliantly, because we've just come off a fantastic day at Sandown on Saturday. We saw, in my view, one of the greats, could be one of the greats of the 2 mile division and possibly further. And yet, in the background or possibly in the foreground, we've got this story that broke last week that you've been alluding to. And I think it's something not only everyone in racing needs to stand up and take notice, but I think anyone who cares about sport and anyone, frankly, who cares about personal freedom and the ability to be able to spend your money as you see fit should care about this. So I think this story needs to go way beyond racing, because this is about where the state should intervene or indeed not intervene in allowing people to make choices about how they spend their money. We all accept the need to address problem gambling to the extent that exists, which it does, and we all need to make sure that those measures are properly targeted. But what we're dealing with here is a one-size-fits-all mechanism that is impacting racing disproportionately, that is not yet founded in legislation, and in many ways is still being trialled. And we already have evidence of significant migration to the unregulated market, where anyone who does have a problem can't be monitored, can't be seen. Meanwhile, it is impacting the betting experience of a significant number of people, most of whom gamble on racing and other sports without a problem, and is having a significant knock-on effect to racing's finances. And why should we care about that when we're thinking fantastically who's going to win the champion chase at the festival? That's a great debate to have, but we should all be worried about this simply because this knocks on to businesses like ours. This knocks on to our ability to invest, not just in prize money, which is obviously keen, which is obviously important to so many, but also to facilities, to infrastructure, and ultimately the racing experience, which ultimately impacts horses in training and ultimately impacts jobs. And those are two languages, I think, that politicians understand. One is jobs and the other is taxes, and this will impact on both. So it's that knock-on effect through the ecosystem as to why this is important. This isn't just about us having enough prize money to compete with Ireland. This is about us having an industry that is healthy, that is sustainable in the long term. And these untested and frankly draconian measures around people's ability to bet are having a significant knock-on effect to all of that.
The thing I greatly appreciate about having the insight from both of you is, first of all, you're very powerful names in the industry, but both of you also cannot be fooled because you're seeing the actual impact of what's really happening. And you're also able to see the data about whether or not these checks are really helping people. And the fact is that this conversation has been weaponized quite a bit in corporate media, and racing itself came under attack by ITV. For whatever bizarre reason, ITV chose to run a story that was incredibly negative about racing and offered no voice to Nevin, no voice to Julie Harrington, no voice to anybody from the Jockey Club, the BHA, or any member of ITV as well, for that matter. And the reason I mention that is because it seems as though corporate media have picked a side in this fight. And the side is, well, the anti-gambling people, they seem like they're on the right crusade, so let's get behind them. And then we're all painted as the bad guys. But ultimately, this deeply impacts racing. And the sport can't survive without betting. The two things are intrinsically linked. So from your perspective, Geoff, over the last couple of years of these being implemented, in real terms, how has it affected you? How has it affected your customers? And how has it affected racing overall?
Clearly, as a business, we have seen, we're talking about over the last 5-6 years of the Gambling Commission, and they're becoming increasingly out of control and driven by the ideal that we can get to net zero problem gambling. That appears to be where they're headed with these measures, net zero problem gambling. And to a certain extent, when I hear comments like one problem gambler is one too many, I think in many ways, comments like that are particularly unhelpful in the debate. Of course, we have, as a business, seen a notable decline in sports betting. And uniquely, we are exposed. We are a sports betting company, and we are uniquely exposed. What's critical in all of this debate is that here we have measures that our customers do not support. And the Gambling Commission know that people, that punters, are unhappy handing over and unwilling to hand over their financial paperwork. It appears that they've gone into their little rooms to decide policy and base policy upon the fact that they know that customers are reluctant to hand over these papers, but they're going to force the measure through. And if the customers are unwilling to give the paperwork, there is a financial paperwork in order to have a bet for two reasons. That's affordability is one reason, which they're now calling vulnerable checks. But the other elephant in the room is these anti-money laundering checks. Now, this has been weaponized by the Gambling Commission as if a punter who, say, for example, bets £50 on a horse, who might, during the course of a month, might lose, say, £1,000. That punter can turn over an impressive amount of money in that month. He may win, he may lose, but it's all about his turnover, his deposits, his withdrawals. And the Gambling Commission has weaponized money laundering in order to achieve its ends of reducing the totality of gambling. And so when you talk about that, they have fined operators for deposits and withdrawals over a series of months. For example, in the GameSys example, they fined the operator for doing business with a gentleman who deposited apparently £14,000 over several months. And that was described as an egregious offence. They hadn't done checks. Whereas in reality, I can tell you in my experience of 40 years of gambling, that what people do is they employ a betting bank. Mm-hmm. They deposit when they want to bet, they withdraw their money when they win, and they redeposit when they fancy having another bet. This has gone on since the dawn of time, since Stanley Kubrick was filming Monolith in the jungle. That has been what has happened in betting. But the Gambling Commission are basically weaponizing money laundering. It's a huge problem for the operators because when they weaponize it, they don't put a number on it, Emmet. They refuse to put a number on what they consider to be a concern for money laundering in this country. And they are treating the whole community of punters as if they're all money launderers. And that is a huge issue for operators today. And no wonder the operators are terrified of the Gambling Commission, in the manner in which they conduct business, the fact that they don't put any numbers to these things to say, you must do enough, these levels are too high, or these levels are, inadequate, or you haven't done enough checks, without specifying anything in terms of numbers, without specifying the requirements in the LCCP. That is essentially our regulatory guide, is the LCCP, we call the licensing conditions, and they're not specified in any of these essential documents. They're in their guidance, they're in their speeches. And so this is no way for any businesses to operate. And it's little wonder, Emmet, that the bookmakers are so terrified.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. And I can understand why people would get very annoyed at the big corporate bookmakers. And look, I've been annoyed at some of them myself. I think some of them are clearly actively very engaged in racing and want the sport to thrive. I think some of them have become distracted with America. But the reality is, you can't really blame them for this, Nevin. This has gotten out of control. The amount of bookmakers who have been fined for money laundering offences, when in actual fact, that's not really what's actually happened. It's just that's what gets labelled. And you were talking about this, I thought, very eloquently with Matt Chapman on the opening show on Saturday. And it was great that ITV platformed this debate in the way that they did. And it was great that you were able to be part of it. But you didn't hold back in your criticism of the Gambling Commission. The same can be said for Martin Cruditz and his statement on behalf of ARC during the week as well. It seems as though racing has now very much realised that there's a line drawn in the sand and something needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think racing's been talking about this for some time. As I also said to Matt on Sunday, actually, I think in my very first answer, this is something we have seen coming. This is something we've warned about. This is something that has infused the public policy debate on this for some time. We've articulated why we think it doesn't work, because as I said earlier, all it does is really drive people to a place where their problem can't be diagnosed, can't be seen. But I think now that we are seeing the impacts of it, we're certainly intending, and we need to be even more vocal about it. We obviously led a petition to Parliament. We had debates. We've had multiple letter writing campaigns to MPs and members of the House of Lords. That probably needs to be renewed. Nick Timothy, to his immense credit, new MP for West Suffolk, has been very vocal on this. We need other advocates to join him, because this is not just an intrusion into unnecessarily into personal freedom. This is about an industry that is disproportionately affected by some of this, and it's quite right that industry then gets on the front foot and argues its case, which is what Martin and I are very clear that we need to be doing, and what hopefully when a new BHA chief exec comes in, that person will be doing as well, because I think this is something where there really is a strong case to be made that goes way beyond just the impacts of this on one specific industry. That this, for me, as I said earlier, goes to fundamental debate about personal freedoms and the intervention of what we might call the nanny state, where it appears we're banning ads on porridge now as well. So it's part of that same theme. And I think if we can show tangible examples of where there's economic damage from this sort of state-led attitude, then I think it's something that a lot of people will rail very, very heavily against.
Well, the observation has been made that the Gambling Commission's stance on this appears to be that if there's problem gambling, we'll then just reduce gambling. And that's
yes. I mean, I think that seems to be where they are. Their remit is to facilitate in legislation is to facilitate safer gambling. That does not mean reducing the level of gambling. They're two very, very different things. And the route they seem to be going down, to take Geoff's net zero analogy from a couple of minutes ago, which I think is an excellent one, is that their view is that if we reduce and we make gambling as an activity toxic, and we effectively become an anti-gambling institution, then we will have done our job, because we will have reduced the level of gambling, which by definition reduces the level of so-called problem gambling. Whereas a much more rational way to look at it, and a much more freedom-led way to look at it, if I may use that phrase, is to say, how do we identify? There is plenty of data out there that allows operators to identify who and where the problem gamblers are. And Geoff's got more experience of that than me, but fundamentally it should be much, much more targeted in that way, and leaving the large majority to enjoy betting on racing, sport, whatever it is they happen to bet on, perfectly unencumbered. But that's not what's happening at the minute.
Well, the conversation about personal freedoms, then, it's very, very relevant, because everybody watching this likes a bet. And everybody watching this is a racing fan, and listening to this is a racing fan. But if there's somebody in the room with you who's not into horse racing, bear in mind that the estimates are 608,000 people are full-blown alcoholics in the UK. It's over 20% of the UK population has some kind of, at least engages in binge drinking. The costs to the NHS annually are £3.5 billion and about 27.4 billion in wider society costs, problems with alcohol. Well, if you're going to tackle gambling with a mallet and not actually come in with a fair approach, they're obviously going to do the exact same thing to alcohol at some point. And by the time people would realize that and to say, whoa, we all like to have a glass of wine with dinner, we don't need to go crazy. If you've already implemented a smoking ban and you've already implemented severe gambling restrictions, then they're going to implement restrictions to the amount of sugar you consume, the amount of chocolate you can eat. There's no stopping this. The nanny state then really is in control.
Well, I think
by the way, that has massive implications for tax take. We're probably straying off topic a little bit, but the economics of this, the public economics of this are very interesting, because if you start restricting activities that generate tax to fund the public sector, then you very quickly find a much bigger public sector deficit, the one over and above the one we've already got, or you have to significantly reduce public sector activity. It's one of the two, because it's the private sector, it's these sectors, racing, betting, the alcohol industry, the food industry, they're the ones that generate the wealth that funds the state. So that's one thing that seems to have been lost in all of this. So I think it's really important that in framing public policy, that it gets the right balance between freedom and economic growth, and we seem to be losing that a little bit at the minute.
I mean, you've got to remember that when we talk about, I mean, I will point everybody out to Chris Fawcett, who's a machine, literally a machine algorithm specialist, who incidentally offered his services to the Gambling Commission on their lived experience panel. He's a very sensible man. He knows betting backwards. He's very methodical about what he does, produces a lot of charts, and does a lot of study into the gambling industry. And he offered his services to the Gambling Commission on their lived experience panel, and he was rejected. He was rejected. And the reason why he was rejected is because the Gambling Commission invents lived experience panel. These are people with experience of, supposedly with a wide experience of gambling, and they create lived experience panels with individuals who only have experience of gambling harm, or are experts in, or so-called experts in gambling harm. They don't want people who represent the 99.7% of the population who experience no harm from gambling whatsoever. They are totally unrepresented in in policy at the Gambling Commission. And I thought it was very interesting to hear that Chris Fawcett offered his services at the lived experience panel as an expert in gambling and was rejected. And it appears to be where we are in the debate with the Gambling Commission. They simply want to hear no opposition whatsoever, not even from the general public, who fill out surveys and roundly tell the Gambling Commission that they are against these measures, and they are being ignored. They want no opposition to their views. But the reality is, you cannot bake a cake and not break a few eggs. And that we have to, as a society, we can have no more road deaths on our road if we remove all the cars and the lorries. If we just remove them all, we'll have no more road deaths. We'll have achieved net zero, no motoring deaths. It's wonderful. It's great. And the same is true of all what's called addictive products. And I hate this word addiction, because when we talk about addiction, what we're talking about is something that's very popular to do. It's a release for humans to do it. When people go out and they go down the pub, and maybe they do from time to time drink too much, or they go racing and they have a bottle of champagne and have a little bit too much, they're still enjoying themselves. Their working lives are hard. Their family lives are often hard. So these are the releases that humans need, and nobody is respecting that point of view. And the fact of the matter is that in every addictive product, you're always going to have people who just take it that little bit too far.
Yeah.
When you talk about surveys, these surveys produced by the Gambling Commission are loaded surveys with loaded questions to people who they know are more tendons to have problem gambling, but they're not actual problem gamblers. They've just been asked questions which are loaded, which come out, they then extrapolate into a number and then try to claim the problem to be bigger than it is. This is not a reality. This is not a hard number. This is not Entain, Bet365, and Flutter telling you what the actual numbers are. And they can. And we as operators, we definitely have the technology these days, machine learning and these kind of things, to be far more effective in dealing with problem gambling, rather than just throw a blanket up across the whole gambling community and say, in order to have a bet, you've got to send Geoff Banks or you've got to send Entain your bank statement to have a bet. We have the technology. And in actual fact, we also now have the will to deal with the problem, but we're not being asked to do that. What we're being asked to do is to reduce the overall totality of gambling in the United Kingdom and to have measures that achieve that exact end. We are actually dealing with the immolation of gambling. We are being asked effectively to kill off the industry, the gambling industry in the United Kingdom, and all the revenue and all the jobs and all the enjoyment that it creates for people. What Andrew Rhodes and his team are doing is inviting operators like me to take my business offshore. I have the expertise. I have the know-how. There are people out there willing to give me licenses in all sorts of states. The government, the United Kingdom government, get no tax. I could, if I went abroad to Kanawaki or Antigua or any of these sort of places, behave in any way I want. I can let people gamble all night if they want to, let them take American Express cards if they want to, they can max out their American, and I don't have to care. I can do that as an operator. I can just take my expertise offshore. And all of the major gambling companies are set up right now in the black market. They are all offshore entities. 365, Entain, Flutter are all domiciled abroad. They are capable of moving their business offshore just like that. Just as fast as they came to the UK, they can do it again. You have to set every target, every parameter, every measure of keeping UK gamblers, including problem gamblers, betting in the United Kingdom in the regulated market. That should be your target. Achieving the best tax revenues that you possibly can, achieving the highest jobs that you possibly can. That should be, as a responsible regulator, your target. But this is not the target of the United Kingdom Gambling Commission.
And maybe the most worrying thing about this is that some of those big firms, if racing was to collapse tomorrow, God forbid, they wouldn't bat an eyelid. Their profits aren't going to really be affected. And in fact, one of the most worrying things that came out of the statistics recently is how, despite all of the affordability checks which have been put in place to try and protect vulnerable people, we know that the people who are most vulnerable as gambling addicts are susceptible to online casino betting. That's what can really get out of control. You can actually win. I'm not saying everybody does. Most people don't. But at least you have a chance of winning on sports betting. You have a chance of winning as a horse racing bettor. You have a chance of winning as a football bettor. As long as your bookmaker isn't restricting you unfairly, you've got no chance of winning on the online casinos. That's why they're so happy to have them. Geoff does not have an online casino. You got rid of that division from your website. You could very easily keep that open. I'm sure it was very profitable for you, but you siphoned that off and decided not to have one. Is that something that should be done? And I'd like to ask you this, Nevin, as the CEO of the Jockey Club. Should horse racing and maybe sports betting be separate from casino betting?
Yeah, I think we all can see the stats and see that the relative risk factors around problem gambling. The problem gambling rates on racing is actually similar to scratch cards. That's not a well-known, generally accepted truism, but it is. And it's also true of other sports. And of course, what we're doing, we're effectively caught up in a bind here because we are being impacted by legislation that actually really, I think most people who are framing it would say it is aimed at casinos and slots. That is where the highest risk factors are. Chris, on his podcast yesterday, set that out very, very well as to what the repetitive nature of those sort of products, games of chance, if you will, versus games of skill. So I think there is a case for that. I think there's a very strong case for that. There's a question as to whether or not, looking back, we in sport and racing should have made that case more strongly some months ago, some years ago even. And is that still potentially on the table? Because I do think that there's scope for if there was a more sophisticated approach to how gambling is regulated, that's certainly one of the first things you would look at doing. Let's target the actual activities that are causing the problems, and let's have a different framework for those where risk rates or problem gambling rates are significantly lower. So yes, I think that is something that we should look at revisiting. I think we're a long way from that. I think we need to get the basic message landed first that the impacts these are having, and then in the sort of it's a diagnosis phase, and then in the sort of prescription phase, work out what is we can do about it while still maintaining the controls we need to target problem gambling. But ultimately, if you're taking a more targeted approach to the whole thing rather than a one-size-fits-all, then in some ways that solves the problem in itself. Because what you're then able to do is to target the characteristics and the behaviours and the people who you are suspicious who have a problem. You can look at how you regulate their behaviour regardless of what they're betting on, and then you solve the problem, or you address the problem, I should say, in a more targeted way, regardless of what they're betting on. That's what should be happening, rather than sort of one size fits all.
Yeah, Geoff, your thoughts on it?
Well, I think what we've seen certainly over the last couple of years is fantastic support from both Jockey Club and Arena Racing in driving forward a sensible agenda and offering sensible solutions for our problems in life. But I have to say that the British Horse Racing Authority, who set themselves up as the regulator of this sport, have been very unhelpful indeed, and that's being polite to the whole debate. They should, as a regulator, recognise, as the champion of British racing, they should have recognised these problems to the finances of their own sport. Now, their view appears to be that we can't go up against another regulator. This appears to be their take on the matter, and they are not vocal in remonstrating with government, remonstrating publicly that that racing and betting are fully independent, interdependent, and to work with the operators to produce the safest gambling environment that we possibly can, and as well as maximising the turnover of British racing. They have nothing to say. And as the regulator of British racing, I do find that stance enormously unhelpful. And there, I'm being polite.
Was there a quote from Greg Swift over the last few days that one of the solutions to the deficit that British racing is facing is Premier Racing? Did I read that correctly?
Yes, that's what Greg said at the press conference last week, or the Q&A last Wednesday, whatever day it was. And look, I think we can have a debate about Premier Racing if you want, 2-year trial, but I think it's fair to say that it hasn't had the impact, for reasons that you will be aware of, Emmet, and we've talked about, that we would like. It does probably need, and I'm sure it will be revisited at the end of that period. But for my money, a much better answer, a much better solution would be to look at our whole betting product. How do we innovate it? This is something Richard and I touched on Saturday morning. Racing has been slow to innovate its product, the allure of its product around multi-leg bets, bet builders, things that are more sophisticated, especially for a younger betting audience that other sports, especially football, have been very strong on. And racing in many ways has still got a fairly vanilla product, if you allow me to use that phrase, by comparison.
Yeah, I'd agree.
I think this is where we can help ourselves a bit more.
Yeah, I'm keen to explore that a little bit more, actually, and even have questions for both of you about how that could be diversified. I just feel like that's not something that can just be let go. There's an article in the Racing Post from a few months ago when the multi-award-winning journalist Lee Mottersett said there isn't a single executive in British racing that thinks Premier Racing is working, and you're the CEO of the Jockey Club, you handed back Premier Racing fixtures.
Yes, we did.
There's very, very few racecourse executives who think that it's working. So why is one of the senior executives at British Racing saying that one of the solutions to it is something that nobody in a major position in British Racing's leadership actually thinks is functioning? That's not very encouraging.
No, it's not on that, and which is why I think it will be revisited at the end of the period. And I mean, I think we all know that it ended up encompassing too many fixtures. There has been an uptick in betting numbers on the Saturday window that was created as a result of it, where we put fewer fixtures into that Saturday window. That's definitely had a positive impact, but probably not as much as maybe people would have thought. And look, I think give it time to play out, but I'm sure that will be revisited at the end of the period. I think it has to be.
Yeah, it does. And look, I could give you a positive about the Racing League and tell you that the betting turnover is pretty decent for it. But the reason the betting turnover is decent for the Racing League is because it's competitive racing because of high prize money. You don't need you're wasting money paying team managers. You don't need that. Get rid of the whole bells and whistles thing. You're not trying, it doesn't apply to you, Nevin, because you're a Jockey Club.
You need to be having this conversation with Martin Crummins.
Yeah, but you're not attracting crowds. You're not increasing the viewing figures. The attendances are very poor, and you're wasting money on people that don't need to have money spent on them. That money needs to be going into the sport itself. So look, I find the BHA stance on this to be pretty disappointing. I would like to think that that's going to improve, and there's going to be a new CEO soon enough. We have to wait with bated breath to find out who that's going to be. Just in terms of revolutionizing the betting product, Geoff, is that something that the sport has really failed in terms of racing itself? Has it failed to properly look at different ways of enticing new people to come to the sport? There was a suggestion from Josh Apiafi way back in January on the Final Furlong about some kind of lotto game that you could potentially play, whereby maybe it's a tote product, but that you're buying your lottery ticket and you could buy a quick pick of horses for the day, and if those horses happen to go and win, maybe you manage to get yourself some kind of a jackpot. There's a way of revolutionizing the betting, and there just doesn't appear to have been too many steps taken.
I don't think I tend not to agree, I'm afraid. I think the problem is we haven't done enough, but there's a lot of entrenched views. I mean, I hear entrenched views, for example, every year about one day in the calendar, the Shergar Cup Day at Ascot, which tries a novel format with 12 runners and all this. They're all handicaps and everything else like that. It appeals to the crowd, gets good crowds at Ascot. Ascot do a very good job in promoting the day and making it a little bit different. And entrenched views in the industry continuously rubbish things like that. And this is like what I think this, the premierisation, I think probably was down to the fact they simply had too many fixtures. When you talk about the word premierisation, you probably mean to say that you're just going to have a Cheltenham, or you're just going to have an Ascot, or you're just going to have a Newbury or something like that. And that's going to be premierisation, whereas it ended up at sort of, at Plumpton and these sort of places, and the racing wasn't particularly good, and 4 and 5 runners, and it's not particularly attractive. But racing actually should be doing more of this kind of stuff. The all-weather finals, for example, was an excellent idea. I hate to big up Martin Cruddas, he won't thank me, but the fact of the matter is he was right in producing these formats. We need to do more of this kind of stuff rather than less. We need to get away from the people that say, oh, I don't like the Shergar Cup. Why? Because they don't personally like betting on it, because it's not quite as easy as when there's an 11-8 chance that probably should be 11-10. And, they don't like the for the field format where it's all very, very difficult. There's girl jockeys and there's these overseas jockeys who haven't got a clue how to ride Ascot Racecourse, that's for sure. But, they don't like these kind of things. And there are very entrenched views in racing. And I would like to see racing do more. And they're going to find the right format eventually. I don't think they're very well led. And I'm not talking about the racetracks. I'm talking, again, about the British Horse Racing Authority. I don't think they're very well led in what they seem to make too many colossal blunders in life. The jockeys, the whip things and all these bans that get reversed, a number of jockeys that are on the sidelines and stuff like that. I think then they're not very methodical or right about the way they think, but I would certainly do more. But I wanted to also just widen the conversation to the points that Richard Hoyles made about big companies and their attitudes to betting. And Richard Hoyles made the point about, how, customers are being restricted, and that's reducing the overall cake, and that's, according to his argument, a central plank of the reduction in racing's turnover of £3.2 billion of turnover in British racing. I would point to the more global figure that Chris Fawcett highlighted yesterday, which is 8.7 billion, nearly £9 billion has been wiped off sports betting, including football, down 25% since 2018. Now, don't tell me that football's got worse. It's got better. Yeah. It's got better as a product. All of these, what's actually happening is the Gambling Commission have presided over an environment that has wiped the turnover across the sports. It's not just horse racing. So to blame horse racing, to single out horse racing as they're not doing a very good job and everything else like that. Yes, there are factors I want to see improve. We're all sick of 4-runner races. I wish we had gone down the road years ago, which was led by Paul Bitar. And I remember arguing at the BHA, sitting around the table with the boys and sort of saying, we should do away with 4-runner races. We've had 2-runner races, 1-runner races. They shouldn't get any prize money for stuff like this. It should just be, that's it, the race is off. We'll take the money and we'll use it elsewhere. But the bottom line is that we, these kind of what Richard Hoyles was basically saying is that the bookmakers have caused the problem, but the overall numbers suggest that sports betting, the whole betting environment, has been hit by measures incepted by the Gambling Commission. And to those that sort of say that companies like Entain are responsible for the overall decline in horse racing, I would say that in an environment created by the Gambling Commission, created by the regulator, this environment of fear, these companies, the Entains, the Flutters, the Bet365s, are going to naturally look at their global product. They're global, what they look like to markets like America. Entain, for example, who said, yes, we'll do affordability checks, had just come off a £19 million fine for procedural failures. Procedural, by the way, not actual money laundering, but procedural failures that they had made as a company. If I was running that company, I think I would be tended to be very, very conservative about the UK market, even to the point of saying, well, we won't bother with the UK market. We can't grow there. Yeah. Our business is on the decline. And so therefore, we'll just make sure that we focus our businesses in other areas where we're not being hit so hard. And America is hugely attractive. Why? Because the Americans don't view things in a prohibition stance, in a prohibition way. They've learnt their lessons. And so therefore, that offers colossal growth. Are you going to risk gaining the licenses and the acceptance over in the United States because some pithy little regulator in the UK has decided that you haven't followed your own procedures? Because that is why Entain and Flutter and 365 have all been fined. Procedural failures. You make up the rules, the gambling said, yours, and if you don't follow your own rules, we're going to fine you. But they haven't found a single instance of money laundering, as far as I'm aware, in the last 5 years in online betting in the United Kingdom. Not a single instance where somebody has been found to be using money fraudulently with online companies. It just doesn't happen. And so this is the environment in which these companies are existing. So I think I would say to Richard Hoyles is, I think you need to look at, when you talk about the betting product, and I understand that I'm in the business and he's in the business, one of the best commentators in the business. Only as we know, the Irish have the best commentator.
He's the best. He's the best commentator.
Yeah, he's a stunner, Richard Hoyles, in his ability to read races. And betting is my business and not his. But I respect his opinions very much. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at these companies, you have to think big, because that's what they are.
Yeah, the only thing that's been pointed out to me a few times is if you're a major bookmaker, a major sports betting company, and you're applying for a license in a state which has just legalized it in America, you need to be thinking about what the Gambling Commission's actions with you are. Because if they've just sanctioned you or issued you a fine, that state in America might look at that and go, well, we don't think you're actually suitable for this particular gambling license. And that's the gold rush. And the problem is
MGM and all these other companies, Caesars, all in competition with you for those licenses, and they're going to win the contracts. And that is the reality. So, I think we have to bear these things in mind. Of course, I want Peter Jackson and the other CEOs of these companies to be more vocal, to defend their industries against disinformation and lies perpetrated about the industry, which I think are deeply unhelpful. I think that's something that Nevin's covered on Saturday, very eloquently, that there is an enormous amount of disinformation and lies being spread about the industry, and that almost seems to fuel the debate and drive policy. And I think as an industry, and I'm very pleased to see that the Betting and Gaming Council have adopted a new approach under Gráinne Hurst. It seems this woman is not for turning. And the bottom line is that we need, as an industry, as well as to be aligned with the racetracks and all of our partners, basically to be aligned to combat disinformation where it exists. And by the way, disinformation within the Gambling Commission as well, with these flawed, deeply flawed surveys that they're foisting on the media, foisting on the gambling reformers, the anti-gamblers, is foisting information that they know is false, that they know is demonstrably inaccurate, and they go, but we've still got to release this because we've done the work and we spent X number of £1 million on this, so we're just going to release it anyway. And then they spend their time firefighting. Heads should roll for things like that. Heads would roll in Nevin's organisation if they produced data like that. They would and go, well, actually, you can't take this data to represent all of our racetracks. It only applies to this one. It's nonsense.
If we produced data, Emmet, that we knew was wrong, and that we put it out, that would effectively be a fraud. And if a FTSE 100 company did that, it would be the same. And the chief executive and the CFO would both lose their jobs. It's as simple as that. So, but yet what Geoff very eloquently described is a situation where these statistics about gambling harm and suicides and other things which do exist. We're not denying that this happens, but it happens in an infinitesimally small number of cases. But the mainstream media and other elements, including, I have to say, elements within the government, seem to be taking these numbers unchallenged and as read, and they are, as Geoff says, beginning to drive public policy. And I can't think of another instance in any sort of industry I've worked in or had contact with this is the case. And I used to work in the energy industry, obviously another very emotive area, in terms of pricing and billing and costs of energy and the impact of that on people's livelihoods. And, in there, yes, there was lots of things that were taken out of context and lots of headlines that were wrong around profit numbers and what drove it and so on. But at least there we were dealing with actual numbers that everyone accepted were correct. That was about interpretation and whether or not it was right for an energy company that needs to invest in energy infrastructure and storage and so on should be making 600 million a year. That's a legitimate debate to have. But at least we were having that debate based on numbers that were real and weren't being infused to suit an agenda.
Yeah, but what the BHA's now interim CEO, well, he will eventually be the interim CEO. Julie Harrington is still there. Surprisingly quiet on this matter. I think that's something that Geoff pointed out on X the other day, and I think it's very fair to point that out. Where is Julie Harrington on this matter? But he was debating one of the senior executives at PETA on Sky, and this was in the aftermath of the horrific incidents of what happened at Cheltenham. The thing I found bizarre about that, and I find Brandon Sheet to be a very, very good speaker. I find him to be an eloquent speaker, and he's well able to defend himself and well able to defend his positions and the BHA's positions. But he didn't go on the offensive. And I can quote statistics to you about PETA that are horrific. I can quote stories to you about PETA that are truly horrific because I have debated them on Talk Radio, what is now Talk TV. But suffice to say, 80% of the animals in their care since 1998 up until last year were slaughtered. And we're not talking about elderly pets. We're talking about perfectly fit and healthy animals. PETA have had employees who were arrested dumping what were healthy puppies, kittens, dogs, and cats that they had taken from animal shelters in Atlanta, said they were going to get them adopted, then slaughtered them before leaving the state and were caught dumping their bodies in dumpsters. They were arrested for that. PETA are a vicious and horrible organization. Their founder is very much of the opinion that the bond between human beings and animals should be broken. And yet that is not at all what Branton Shee was doing. He wasn't fighting back and saying, I'm not going to take lectures from somebody who works for a horrible organization like that. And it seems as though the BHA are very unwilling to just fight fire with fire at all. I don't really see them trying to combat misinformation and disinformation. And this is where they should be taking a lead. It's not incumbent upon, with the greatest of respect, and I very much appreciate that you're in the trenches fighting this fight, but it's not incumbent on the CEO of ARC, Martin Quillance, or the CEO of the Jockey Club, Nevin Truesdale, to be fighting this fight. The BHA should be doing it, but they don't do it, and I don't understand why.
We do need to all be standing up for the sport, Emmet. I think we've all got our role to play. I mean, I would point you to, I'm sure you've seen it, I would point you to Horse PWR because the BHA were instrumental in making that happen. Yeah, we were heavily involved, obviously. Okay, that's a really good example of what should be happening. I do agree that we need to get much more front-footed on this. We need to be much more overt about how we're putting information across. And frankly, we need to tell racing's story. This is an industry that employs 88,000 people and generates 4.1 billion to the economy every year. This is not a small industry. This is not something that can be just ignored. And getting more on the front foot in public about the fantastic good, not just racing, but the thoroughbred does for people and all of the positive things about this sport. I had a very good friend of mine was there at Sandown for the first time on Saturday with her family. She'd never been racing before. And her 12-year-old son, he absolutely loved it. And we were able to get him up close to the horses, and he moved up to John Bon, and he's hooked. And this is the point. This is the thing about getting rid of this misinformation, this false perception about the sport and what it involves and what it doesn't involve around gambling, around welfare. Some of the some of the frankly lies that are spread about it. Once you bring people to the track or you bring people to a yard and you show them what actually goes on, and you get them to talk to a trainer, or you get them to talk to an owner or whatever, or even better a stable lad or a stable lass, and they have the chance to really talk to them about what it means to them. These are the things we should be emphasising. Yes, we need to defend ourselves on the welfare front and on gambling and on those other things that we can do because we've got a good story to tell. But we should be emphasising the fantastic positives of this sport as well. And I don't think we necessarily do as much of that as we could and should.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And just very briefly, because I'm a media nerd, I've loved media since I was a kid, and touch wood, get to work in it. I would have thought Sky News would have the most viewers of the cable news channels or satellite news channels, but GB News does. GB News has more viewers than Sky, and there's a reason for that. It's because people have turned away from lies and misinformation, and they've realized that the lies and the misinformation are not actually coming from the sources that are telling you about the lies and misinformation on social media. They're coming from the very corporate entities that we've watched for years and years and years and enjoyed for years and years and years. But eventually people realize you can't keep lying to people. And I think it's a very interesting talking point, that. And I think it's an interesting time that racing clearly finds itself in a fight, but it's gone down appeasement routes with whip rules, for example. Stop trying to appease people who will never be appeased. Animal rights activists are never going to change their minds. They're never going to be on our side. We need to be able to stand up and fight for the sport as it is and be confident about our sport and acknowledge the fact that a lot of the viewers and listeners to racing and the supporters of this sport, they're intelligent people. They don't want to be patronized. They don't want to be condescended. They understand what's involved in racing. Show them what the sport is. And the fact that a channel like GB News, which kind of comes out of nowhere, can start getting more viewers than Sky, should, whatever your political ideology is, I don't care. It's all corrupt as far as I'm concerned. But it should be able to give you a little bit of confidence that, look, it's the second most attended outdoor sport in the UK. It's the fifth most watched sport in the UK. We're worth a lot to ITV. ITV really needs racing because the only thing they can heavily rely on to get people to watch television, because nobody watches linear television anymore, is sport. But if we're not confident in ourselves and confident that we have a big fan base and start giving what the fans want themselves, as opposed to appeasing an audience that will never be appeased, then we're not going to have a sport to look forward to for much longer.
Sorry, Emmet, just one thing. I don't think we are looking to appease the unappeasable, because there's a group, I mean, all our polling tells us there's probably about somewhere in the mid-20% of people who will never, ever engage with the sport. And there's about the same number on the other side who are converts, fans, watchers, will attend occasionally, whatever. It's that group in the middle that we're targeting. It's what we call the persuadable public. It's the persuadable majority in the middle to say, there's a sport here which you can engage with. Here are all the positive things about it. Here's the changes we're making to make it even more safe and even more acceptable. We can have the debate about the whip if you want, but the reality is that in making any changes we've made, we are being confident. We are targeting that persuadable majority in the middle who want to be persuaded and want to engage. I don't think we are looking to appease, because they are unappeasable.
I would just very briefly say, if you do a survey of 1,119 people for the Whip Consultation Report, and in that you ask them, what is your opinion of the Pro Cush? And if, I think from memory, it was 56% of people were opposed to it. And then when they had it explained to them, maybe it was 65%. But the vast majority were opposed to the Pro Cush. And when it was explained to them that it's not a welfare issue, it's made of fiberglass, rubber, and foam padding, shock-absorbing padding. There's no peer-reviewed study anywhere on the planet that says it causes pain to racehorses when used correctly. Only 12% of the people who had it explained to them changed their minds. Now, the thing that I think leapt off the page when I read that was, okay, these people, it doesn't matter what you do with the whip. They're just going to hate it anyway. So even if you were to ban it, they're still going to hate racing. You're never going to turn their minds around. So why enact a bunch of rules?
I'm not suggesting that it should have been banned. What I'm suggesting is that in making all of those safety-driven changes, I would apply our changes to the Grand National in this category as well, by the way. We are addressing an audience who are not the unappeasable crew. We're addressing that larger group in the middle who want to be persuaded this is a good sport and a safe sport.
And just on that, Dennis O'Regan and I I think it was Dennis O'Regan, Barry Call and I talked about the Grand National that Corrick Rambler won, which was after those changes, and the viewing of that race, certainly the first circuit of the year the previous one was a deeply uncomfortable Grand National to watch, whereas the Corrick Rambler one was better, and I Am Maximus was definitely a much better one this year as well.
I Am Maximus was the cleanest national we've had for a very long time. I think you have to go back to 1992 to find more finishers.
Yeah, the I Am Maximus one was a great Grand National.
I know we're coming to the end of this. I just wanted to make one final point about the Peter thing that you raised. I think Nevin might like as well. There's a strong parallel between the behaviour of people involved with Peter and the anti-gambling reformers. Is that, to me, you're talking about in the United Kingdom, I don't know how many racehorses we've got in training and the studs and everything else, like 20, 30,000 fit, healthy, superb looking animals, clearly well thing. Is that these people, in advocating the measures, they don't care about the consequences of that which they demand. If racing ends, you're talking about you're talking about euthanizing 20 or 30,000 horses. You can't just let them out in the street. They're uncontrollable as animals in that regard. They need to be in a trained environment.
We're rewilding them, Geoff. Come on, get it right. We're rewilding them.
Yeah. I know that.
Are you familiar with the rewilding project in Holland? Over 3,500 cows, deer, sheep, and horses had to be euthanized and culled because it was such a complete and total disaster. And yet they're still advocating. It would be the greatest equine welfare disaster since World War I if it were to be.
You can't move racehorses into another environment. It doesn't work. I've ridden them. I know what they're like. My ex-girlfriend had racehorses and whatever, and they were almost uncontrollable in doing any other function other than racing. Racing is what they love to do. It's in their blood. Peter doesn't care about what happens if racing gets banned. And I heard the other week, Matt Zarb-Cousin, one of the leading anti-gambling campaigners, talking about greyhound racing and how he would see it banned. You're talking about the euthanization of thousands and thousands of greyhounds. Why? Because he's not comfortable with what happens to a tiny element of greyhounds who perhaps don't end up in the right home when their racing careers are over. And anti-gambling reformers are not interested in the consequences of their action when they turn around and they say, we should have no advertising on anything, which would have a catastrophic effect on sports clubs and football teams and cricket clubs and everything else, snooker, tennis, darts, and all these things that depend on the gambling cake to survive. Why? Because they're a natural fit for their money. They don't care about these things. And they don't care about the fact that if you shut down the regulated gambling market, as many of the anti-gambling reformers would have, that would mean that people would just flow to the black market, which would be horrific, absolutely horrific. I can tell you it would be horrific. You don't have to take my word for it. It's in the data. The fact of the matter, all of these people don't care about consequences. So my last point tonight would be to sort of say that this is what we are dealing with these days. People who do not understand nor care for the consequences of their action. The Gambling Commission doesn't care about the increase in slots whilst they've been driving down sports betting. They don't care about the number of people who've gone to the black market since they invented GamStop. They don't care that affordability measures, they know they don't really work. They're just pursuing these courses. So that's my final point. We need to lead, we need to drive the narrative. We need to drive the discussions. And I want to see the Coateses of this world sitting there, probably watching in on this pod when they're sitting there having their dinners and whatever, looking at their daily figures, and they're very impressive. Get involved in the debate. Help us out. Help us out in the debate. It shouldn't be just about the racetracks. It shouldn't be about, those of us who genuinely love betting and racing and dog racing. We need their help.
Yeah, the thing about virtue signaling about climate change, for example, and stopping fossil fuels, is it's all very well and good to lecture and go on about how we need to be all driving electric cars and stop fossil fuels. The estimate is that 60% of the global population would be wiped out if we stop fossil fuels within a week. And never mind the fact that it would be the greatest equine welfare disaster in history, certainly since World War I, were we to ban horse racing tomorrow. Final word to you, Nevin Truesdale, on the entire topic.
There is a significant threat that has emerged for not just for racing, but I think for anyone who believes in the basic freedom of the individual to spend their money as they see fit. And it is having significant knock-on effects to our business, to the wider industry. and it's something that racing and those who love sport, those who love betting, but those who love freedom in general should be standing up against. I think it's really, really important that we continue to maintain momentum around all of this, because it's a very serious debate for all of us to be having. And it's one we must take notice of, and it's a battle we have to win. Well said, Nevin, and well said, Geoff. I've really appreciated your insight from both of you. You're two incredibly strong and vocal voices on this matter, and I greatly appreciate your time on the show, and I know the listeners and the viewers do too. If you're watching this on YouTube, likes are much appreciated. Really hit the like button now. If you're a racing fan, if you love this sport, just hit that like button on YouTube. It means an awful lot. Nevin, thank you so much for your time. Geoff, thank you as well. Your insight and your time is much appreciated. And thank you for spending time with us, listening and watching this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording it. We'll talk to you again very, very soon on the Final Furlong Podcast. Look after yourself and each other. God bless.
The Final Furlong Podcast is proudly brought to you by Geoff Banks Bet. Get up to £500 refunded as real money for new Geoff Banks online accounts after your first month of betting. Use promo code FFP500 at geoffbanks.bet.